All right. Shall we? First of all, let me thank everyone for coming. My name is Daniel Curtis. I'm a professor here in the Hussman School. This room feels like super normal. This is amazing to have 30 or so people on hand for a live talk. Thanks to UNC and our students and administration and everyone else for keeping our positivity rates very low. So enabling us to have gatherings like this, because this is the intellectual life that I really love about this school and UNC. I want to thank the UNC Center for Information Technology and Public Life, as well as the Hussman School's Access, Belonging, Inclusion, Diversity, and Equity Committee for co-sponsoring the Hussman Media Justice Series this semester. This is the last of the 3 talks that we'll be having that explore various issues relating to media and justice. And without their support, this wouldn't have been possible. I also want to acknowledge the recent passing of longtime Hussman faculty member Don Shaw. This is exactly the sort of event that he was in good health. He came to every talk that was in the school. I know he would have very much appreciated seeing you talk about your most recent book. And just as sort of acknowledge his memory and the important role in the intellectual life. Okay, now on to Nikki Usher, who is a longtime friend, collaborator, and giant. He is an associate professor at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, the College of Media. She has affiliate appointments in communication and political science. Prior to that, she was in the DWU School of Media and Public Affairs. She's also a senior fellow at the Open Market Institute Center for Journalism and Liberty, and she's a CTAP faculty associate here as well, and plays a role in our center. She received a PhD in communication from the University of Southern California, also received an MA there as well. Nikki's first book, which is actually the last time that we had her here, Making News at the New York Times, was published in 2014 with University of Michigan Press. It was the first book-length study of the New York Times in the internet era. I did a lot of interviews and ethnography. I had Nikki in to talk to my methods class, in addition to give a book talk. It is brilliant work, one that remains as provocative today as it was almost a decade ago. So I highly encourage everyone to take a look at it as a study in sort of what happens when newspapers make that transition to digital. Her second book, Interactive Journalism, Hackers, Data, and Code, focused on the rise of programming and data journalism. Making News at the New York Times actually won the Tankard Award at AEJ&C, which is the best book in communication journalism. Interactive Journalism was a finalist for the Tankard Award, and I learned this from your bio. You're the first solo author to be a 2-time finalist. So that's a remarkable achievement. Nikki, who never sleeps, currently also has a new edited volume out called Journalism Research That Matters. It's a wonderful collection of chapters co-edited by Nikki and Valerie Dallaire-Gangong at the University of Minnesota. It's published in a series that Nikki co-edits with me, the Oxford Journalism and Political Communication Unbound series. That's actually been one of my great intellectual joys over the last few years. And collaborating with Nikki has just been a wonderful honor, as well as working with junior scholars and more established scholars. So look for more books in that series that we've been hard at work. Nikki's been a fellow at the Tell Center for Digital Journalism at Columbia, a fellow at the Reynolds Institute at the University of Missouri, the winner of the AJMC Emerging Scholar Award, was named the Lillian Lodge Copenhagen Outstanding Junior Scholar. Nikki has won many awards and is very well established in the field, has made a number of foundational achievements. All right, let me just say a few seconds or spend just a few sentences on this book, News for the Rich, White, and Blue, How Place and Power Distort American Journalism. This is a deeply, I think, provocative and challenging text, one that has been making waves in the field of journalism, but also industry. for the ways that it centers questions of geography, class, power in a field and in an industry that has long ignored. And that, I think, is really the foundational achievement of this book. It challenges academics as well as journalists' own conceptions of themselves as social actors. Nikki shows how the social identities of journalists matter in the context of things such as race, class, and locale, even as they navigate larger contexts of social, political, and economic power. Along the way, Nikki questions any necessary relationship between journalism and democracy. She actually shows how journalism can create and perpetuate inequalities. And she ends by arguing, and I want to end on this quote because I loved it. It's literally the final chapter, the final sentence of the book. He's a brilliant writer, but she ends by arguing that, quote, "We may not save newspapers, but we can create an information environment, a culture of democratic life that builds on a post-newspaper consciousness, looks to the news resilience of communities, and seeks to create equity and inclusion in the communication that powers." So that was a wonderful way to end. It ends on a note of hope. And with that, Nikki Usher.
That was great. Can I just like keep you around on those dark nights? I just want to thank everybody for just a lovely day. Katie took the coat off her back and lent it to me, so that's how I'm feeling about the kindness and vibes in this room. So what I've spent most of my time in the academy doing has been trying to understand, how what's happening in the news industry shapes what you ultimately end up seeing. And so news organizations, especially digital first and newspapers, are facing this tremendous economic crisis. And in the book, and I think this is kind of the cornerstone argument, I show how in the quest to survive, news organizations are realigning their priorities in ways that favor audiences who are willing to pay, either in terms of cultural or actual capital, face huge barriers to diversifying and remain stubbornly white institutions, and increasingly end up serving liberal audiences. And this is a story about place. It's a story about the changing news preferences, the larger partisan fracturing in the United States, and I'm trying to talk about the growing distances between journalists and the public across geography, culture, and power. And these are accelerations of existing trends. These are problems that have long been present in journalism. But as newspaper journalism reaches market failure, the consequences begin to be far more extreme than we may have imagined. So today I want to go through kind of these three big points I'm trying to make, and it kind of mishmashes stuff throughout the book, but you'll see it makes sense, and hopefully kind of leave you hungry to read it as well. So number one, newsrooms are places of power that are becoming increasingly inhospitable places for those who are non-white and lack financial resources. And this isn't getting better, with real consequences for coverage. Two, there are affective and political dimensions of distance that emerge when news organizations retreat, or why being somewhere matters. And three, digital drivers of news revenue mean heightened reliance on those willing to pay, with significant consequences for equity and geographically specific news coverage. So I want to offer some setting and context for the project. So at first I thought I was going to be looking at the haves and have-nots of news organizations and looking at like post-industrial labor conditions. And so to that end, I went to the Washington Post opening week celebrations to usher in their new digs under Jeff Bezos, carefully noting the lobster canapé, the guava juice, the made-to-order espresso drinks, the scotch, and it was like this whole week of celebration, and on the digital ribbon cutting day, John Kerry was there, the governors of Maryland, Virginia, and the mayor of DC, toasting to democracy. It was a different time. And I found myself thinking, these news organizations, especially newspapers, are an economic free throw, and there was lobster here at the Post. And I think a lot of people in this room are pretty familiar with this, but it's pretty dire, right? And newspapers have been particularly hard hit, losing $35 billion in advertising between 2006 and 2018. And newspaper employment as a whole from 2005 to today is down about 57%. While I trouble these numbers, and you'll see shortly why, since 2004, right, more than 20% of the country's metro and community newspapers have closed or merged, which, creates these so-called news deserts in 1,800 different communities across the United States. So the interesting thing is that 71% of Americans think that news is doing just fine, and only 14% of Americans, which is up by 2%, are willing to pay for a digital subscription. It's usually just one. So this kind of have and have-not thing was what I was thinking about 10 months before Trump, before it became so abundantly clear how many people, especially journalists, had their heads in the sand about the rising tides of populism. This is the night of the election, Nate Silver's 538. So my focus quickly shifted to something far bigger and far more important, which was that these haves and have-nots of journalism were embedded in a much more significant fracturing of U.S. democracy amid declines in trust in journalism, particularly amid the right, rising social inequality that's instantiated geographically, and of course the giant challenges of reckoning with big tech, Google, Facebook, Amazon in particular. So the book became a lot broader. It's a book about place and power and inequality in journalism that aims to puzzle through how the asymmetries and inequities that we see outside of journalism are manifest inside the news industry as well. And what becomes plainly clear is that only national, non-geographically specific news organizations are likely to survive. And the good news, the news that feeds democratic life, becomes produced and consumed by the blue cultural elite. Because simply put, Republicans increasingly do not trust this news media, and journalism stands to become highly delocalized, even more so than it is today. You can see kind of a map I stole from equitable growth about where GDP is concentrated in the United States, right? So newspapers have reached a state of market failure, and the news that they provide is increasingly becoming a private good that only some people have access to. And so my focus is on newspapers and some digital-first nonprofits, mostly because newspapers have long produced the most original content about any one place. And as places, as news organizations retrench, right, places lose access to news and information. In this book, I'm particularly interested in the top 100 or so newspapers. I call them Goldilocks newspapers. They're not too big and not too small, but just the right size to be squeezed by the digital content economics garbage, But I do really want to say that I caution against this naivete of the view that if a community loses a newspaper, suddenly corruption runs wild, because newspapers have rarely served the poor and marginalized well, and have long played an important role in reinforcing the dominance of existing power structures and maintaining the status quo. I also think it's really important to highlight that affective dimension of journalism, that the role that journalism plays in placemaking, in history shaping, and in community building. And it's that aspect of journalism's impact on democracy that also stands to suffer if journalists are less able to cover places. So Daniel assigns many of the graduate students this piece, which I'm glad, because it's kind of the theoretical heart of the book. So I'm going to talk mostly about the empirical findings today, but the theory, like where I wrestle with place, it's really in the monograph. It's not as evident in the book, shall we say. But the way I think about place is really according to David Harvey and Henri Lefebvre's matrix, where place is an actual place on a map, right? It's also where our social relations unfold. And it's also power on an individual level, right? A place of power, where it happens. But journalists' role in relationship to social institutions and other places of power. So, and I do really think that, yes, different places seem to have very similar characters, right? You go to one suburban mall, looks like just the other suburban mall, but I want to just say that places have their own contexts and their own histories. And just because places look alike doesn't mean they share sort of the same social fabric. And so also throughout the book, there's this overlay of democratic theory. And I argue it's the theory that economic support gives us the democracy we deserve, which increasingly looks to be an elite democracy. So the kind of journalism that provides the good stuff that serves democracy is becoming increasingly distant from the audience it purports to cover. Physically, the news organizations most likely to survive this economic maelstrom are the big postal national and international outlets that simply cannot cover locales in the same depth, and whose journalists may have a cosmopolitan orientation, but it can be actually more parochial than wide-ranging, as Robert Martin might diagnose it. So when Dean Baquet, the New York Times editor, talked to his own media reporter the day after Trump's 2016 election, and he talked about missing the rise of Trump's groundswell of populism, he literally spoke about being out of place. And he said, we've got to do a much better job of being on the road, out in the country, talking to different kinds of people than we talk to, especially if you happen to be a New York-based news organization, and remind ourselves that we are just not the real world. So just kind of a quick note on methods. We can talk about this later. I think maybe we should. But I was saying to some folks that I never really know when I'm doing research anymore. Right? So like, I had coffee this morning with somebody who's a funder, and I got a message earlier today that somebody said the Chicago Tribune's on campus, and like, could we have coffee? Like, is this research? I have no idea anymore, right? Like, I just can't separate these things. But also, I think what surprised me about this book is that I really felt the need to use quantitative methods to get to some of the sort of at-scale trends I was seeing, and I honestly never expected that from myself. So, I mean, I think that it's kind of important to, grow as a scholar and kind of continue to think about the methods you use to tell the stories you want to tell, right? Okay, and I also want to just acknowledge a lot of the data and current release. In particular, I really give a hand off to Meredith Clark, who's a graduate of this program, for all of the excellent work she's done with the ASCII news diversity survey. And I do want to say that all the photos, unless otherwise marked, are ones I've taken. So anyway, first, right, newsrooms are places of power that are becoming increasingly inhospitable places for those who are non-white and who lack financial resources. And it's not getting better. And as these newsroom jobs become increasingly precarious, it's becoming harder for newsrooms to sustain economic and racial diversity. Those with a financial safety net are better able to weather the possibility of job loss or underemployment. So, a note from the field. It's July 8th, 2016, the day after a Dallas man shot and killed 5 police officers in Dallas and wounded 9 others, an event that was said to be precipitated by frustration with police brutality. And I'm in the newsroom of the Omaha Rural Herald, where all the men wear some sort of version of a polo shirt with the newspaper's logo on it, and somehow there are journalists in place that have managed to be there for 40 years thanks to a stock situation. The newsroom's almost entirely white, and at the afternoon meeting, the managing editor looks up and she says she wants to cover Black Lives Matter rally in response to the event. And there's a general expression about the difficulty of the situation. She looks around the newsroom for somebody to cover it, with mention to be ready if there's, quote, trouble. And there's one female Black news assistant, another person of color, and mixed race sports reporters out covering something else. There have to be a good 30 people in the room, plus all the white editors. And these editors thought they were planning sensitive coverage, but it's hard to know because no one in that newsroom was empowered to do so. Note from the field, in March 2018, I'm at the Chicago Tribune to chronicle the newsroom moving out of the Tribune. I'm attuned to the various empty spaces. The newsroom is just too big for the current staff, and I'm encouraged to see some non-white faces scattered across the room. And as I head into the morning page 1 meeting, in which digital strategy is planned, every single person following me into this room of power is white, with only one other woman. So flash forward to this summer's racial unrest, summer 2020's racial unrest, where the Philadelphia Inquirer puts out this guided cover section, Buildings Matter Too. And then, yeah, that one, I feel like I should go back to that. And then in the LA Times Latino Caucus, the LA Times Guild points out this mismatch where LA is a majority Latinx city, and in Los Angeles, approximately 1 out of every 2 residents is Latino, but Latinos only constitute 13% of newsroom employees. So in 1978, the American Society of Newspaper Editors put forth a series of recommendations to improve diversity in the newsroom, and their goal was to be at parity with the population in 2000. Then they moved it back to 2025, measured by an output survey. And this year, newsrooms were reluctant to even answer. on average, American newsrooms, sorry, I went ahead a little. On average, American newsrooms are still more white than the cities they cover, and it's worse at the bigger places. So I wonder, really, so this is the Detroit Free Press, which is 16% Black employees overall. Can it really comprehensively claim to cover race when it serves a city that's 80% Black? In Chicago, 92% of newsroom leaders are white compared to 32% of the population of the metro area. And yes, newsrooms have made gains, but they've struggled to hold on. And as a local news initiative at Northwestern explains, simply put, the newsrooms don't hire minority journalists. Of course, it's not just about representation, and this is from tweets from the New Yorker archives editor a couple weeks ago, and she put it so well, like, white people are rarely actively racist at these publications. They simply never bother to challenge the status quo. Why is this important? Because otherwise friendly, decent white people are really the bedrock upon which passive racism maintains its grip on media mastheads and editorial departments. And she compiled all these really insane stats about the New Yorker, but the one that really got me was that between 1990 and 2020, there was only one profile by a Latino writer and 4 by a black woman. All right. So as Latrell Crittenden, one now EPI's Director of Diversity, Equity, and Engagement puts it, the modern day double consciousness of having to thrive as a person of color inside and outside the newsroom is arguably the most underestimated challenge facing efforts related to improving newsroom diversity. So this is an intersectional problem where race and class get compounded, and a class problem too, right? And so journalists who can afford to be free labor, or who can rely on parents as a backstop against the precarity of free labor, they have the privilege to choose a career that's unlikely to be financially remunerative and much less stable. And we know these are conversations that happen in a journalism school, but I think it's helpful to think about what that economic privilege allows you to do. To move to a big city and take a good internship, to have these opportunities that set you up, right? And while we do want journalists to be educated, right? 90% of journalists are educated, have a college degree relative to 25% of the population. Keeping these favored schools sort of as the pipeline is a real problem. And so when the New York Times Director of Fellowships and Internships, Theodore Kim, tweeted his super unscientific opinion on which schools turn out the most consistently productive candidates, he reflected this bias towards elite schools and state schools with the most competitive journalism programs. Those top choices were Columbia, Northwestern, Berkeley, and Yale, with honorable mentions in no order going to Missouri, Harvard, USC, Florida, Duke, and Stanford. When AIJA crunched some of these numbers at the intern of who was getting to go to the LA Times, Wall Street Journal, NPR, Los Angeles Times, these interns all came from about the top 13% of the most selective universities in the United States. The New York Times and the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal are particularly top 1% of schools are where they're recruiting their interns from. So here's a question, right? Are all interns rich, or are all Harvard students rich? No. But in 2017, the Harvard Crimson found that the median family income for undergraduates was $168K, more than 3 times the national. And so there's this question of what happens when students are at a university doing these work-study jobs, trying to fit in time to do journalism on the side along with their classes. So the Harvard Crimson set up, it's an independent newspaper, and they set up an alumni fund to sort of provide an alternative to work study. So you could get your work study sort of the same amount of money through the Crimson, right? Therefore not having to choose between swiping gym cards and getting sleep and working on the student newspaper. This is not scalable, right, for lots of reasons. And then what got me last week, I think a couple weeks ago, was this journalist in Southern California whose salary just didn't make it possible for him to afford rent. And he was doing the van life thing. And, basically he was like, what keeps me going from this paycheck to paycheck situation is my ideal, right? So as journalism jobs become increasingly precarious, these newsrooms become bastions of privilege, making any meaningful gains in diversity and inclusion more difficult to maintain or advance. And as newspapers enter market failure, current market logics for news can worsen existing inequities and worsen these existing existing inequities in what people and what places end up getting covered. So as Nick, you're a journalist at CKR, if you don't have a single person in your newsroom who comes from a blue collar background or who knows what it's like to wipe down tables at the end of the night, they'll never be able to emphasize when they're writing about things like workers' movements or communities displaced by gentrification. So, number two, there are effective and political consequences when news organizations pull back. So, the loudest voices in American public discourse belong to those journalists whose perspectives are shaped by minimal day-to-day exposure with those who don't live in big cities like them. And this goes for the institutional news media and partisan news media as well. And there is this deep asymmetrical polarization in this country around media trust, with the Republicans distrusting mainstream media significantly more. The October 2021 Gallup poll showed that 11% of Republicans trust the news media compared to 68% of Democrats. We know Democrats are more likely to subscribe because they feel a sense of civic duty, whereas Republicans are more likely to subscribe for the coupons. And so while news organizations start pulling back from local places and national news organizations start coming in to do this coverage, these problems come into full force. So I was curious about this news desert thing, which you all know about here, right? This presumption that, places lose news, they're mostly rural places, they're getting redder. Is that, right? And I kind of wanted to trouble this narrative a little bit. So I asked 3 questions along with my PhD students, Song and Kim. We looked at all 3,143 counties, and we grouped them into, this is the American Community Survey, where you can do like evangelical hubs, LDS enclaves, urban suburbs, right? So you can kind of get a little bit more of a textured understanding of what these communities are like. So this is what we asked us. Are journalists concentrating in big cities? How are different types of American communities affected by the loss of news? Because some of these red blues seem like quite a bit of primary, right? And what evidence actually is there of this association between declining newspaper employment and increased partisanship? The red lines get lost on the Google version, but basically what you can see is New York, DC, and North, right, in their city, did get more concentrated, right? But here's the thing, they were all ready to be a capital. So to what extent is this actually a meaningful change, right? And I think it's more that news attention has nationalized and political attention has nationalized. And there is some noise because of the way that different consolidations have moved journalists around the country. So that's kind of some of what you're seeing. Again, sort of the Google Drive kind of kills some of this, but when we look at who's losing the news by community type, everybody is losing the news. But what really got me is that some places have been historically underserved. These aren't news deserts that happened yesterday. They didn't happen in 2008. These are news deserts that are in places that have just never been served well by news. And they're places that you might expect, right? Working class countries, so Appalachia, the Black Belt, African American South, Native American tribal lands, right? They just never been covered well, right? Historical news desert. So, and then, this question about partisanship and losing the news, what I found is it's how you measure it. So blue places lost journalists and got bluer, red places lost journalists and got redder. So there's got to be something more going on, right? If you look within industry and you kind of compare things, right, what you end up finding is that red places actually have more journalists relative to these blue places. So, and part of that is an economies of scale function, right? And then when we look at the types of communities that are losing news in associations with shifts in partisan vote share, what we find is only one type of county really gets redder, and that's the excerpts. And the excerpts have just gone through a lot of change in the past 15 years. So anyway, I think it's also the power of the national narrative, maybe more so than the growth of these news deserts. So in the wake of 2016, the New York Times and all these other news organizations promised to do better. So they sent journalists to live in some of the places they would cover. So Sydney Ember, prior to the 2020 primaries, moved to Iowa. So I wanted to understand Iowa, so I moved there. Dateline Des Moines, I was intrigued. And she goes on to talk about her experiences going bow hunting with the Iowa State Auditor. I've been to Iowa Pride, I did not go bow hunting, so it's kind of like, and then there are these Trump safaris where people went like 2016 and 2020 to who are these Trump voters? And it's like, go ask your mom, right? Like, go down the hallway, go down the apartment. Like, you can, who are these anti-vaxxers? Literally, just go knock 3 doors down, right? You don't need to go into, some rural place in Arkansas to find an anti-vaxxer. So in 2013, and this is where I think the affective side of it is really important. So in 2013, I noticed that these newsrooms were moving newsrooms into much smaller spaces. So the Des Moines Register, they thought this building looked like the Daily Planet from Superman. Now they are in a shopping mall with, these are skyways in the Midwest, if you're familiar with them. So there's no visible sign that the Des Moines Register exists here. Miami Herald, this building no longer exists. They could not get recognition for its historic preservation as a mid-century modern building. And actually, the wreckage footage showed up on burn notice, so it is something that the public recognized. So this is the view from downtown before. This is the view across the street from after, and now actually the Miami Herald doesn't have a newsroom. It became too expensive. But I thought that this quote really pulled it together, which is, it's bad for the psyche for there to be no building to exist for people to see every day. We're fighting for a brand share, particularly with the generation who thinks we're nothing but dead trees. You can't tell that's a cow pasture, so they moved out by the airport near a cow pasture. And I think this stuff really matters. So when the LA Times, its building was downtown, it was really, really close to Skid Row. And so what that meant is when journalists parked their car and walked the block across the street to go to the LA Times news meeting, they were forced to encounter some of the city's most desperate residents. And so the movie The Soloist is actually a story of Steve Lopez, a columnist of the LA Times, and his encounters with this schizophrenic concert violinist who was right outside the LA Times, right? And so it's kind of, what do you lose when these newsrooms disappear? And so now the LA Times is in a nondescript building in El Segundo, kind of near the finishing compound. But this is where I think it gets really interesting about place. DC, right? DC, if you want to talk about places and bubbles, right? DC is the perfect example. So I don't know if you remember during the Trump administration, there was this place, Steakhouse, that used to be like, oh, we heard these people talking about, overstate. And it's right underneath the Times Bureau. So it's like, that's why you want to leak something at Times, you have lunch at BLT Steak. I mean, that's, yeah. So, right, that's the place, right? And so I actually went around with the Senate press gallery for a day. It was actually very hard to get it passed, which is a separate story. But, right, you look at this image, this is the worst. Like, this is like tech journalism at the absolute worst. And you can't even see Dick Durbin, who they're swarming. But it actually matters. And so I have this chapter that actually I workshopped at University of Utah, so it got a lot better. Thanks, you. And so what it was is these Washington correspondents, many of them come through the internship sort of system. Emma Dumaine, who I talked to for this, she went to Dalton, which is New York City private school, then went to Oberlin. She's covering South Carolina with kind of not a ton of connections to the state. So some of these journalists, because there wasn't money to travel back, had never actually been to the places that they were purportedly covering from, right? But Emma's knowledge of Congress wasn't South Carolina. It was literally like the place of the building. She physically knew which way all of the 9 members of Congress could walk, right? We're walking from cloture to their vote. And she could pigeonhole them. She could literally be in their face to ask a question about South Carolina. Right, and it's not that the coverage is really all that different than what you might see from the AP. It's their physical presence that I think matters. So we'll move on to number 3, which is that the digital drivers of news revenue mean heightened reliance on those willing to pay, with consequences for equity and access and geographically specific news coverage. So I'm going to begin with a counterpoint, which is the Times. And for this crew, I will say I felt some pressure to go back to the Times to show I could do it again, which is an irrational way to feel. But I did want to say, I can do this again. I'm not a one-trick pony, So anyway, I went back to the Times, and I talked to Lydia Palgreen, who was then editor-in-chief of Huffington Post. She had run New York Times Global, and I thought she put it in this amazing way, which is the rise of the Times as a global news organization in some ways mirrors a rise in inequality, where there's a global class of connected citizens who rely on a handful of preferred, largely English sources of news and information. And so the New York Times has staked its survival on trying to convert the 38 to 40 million New York Times readers who live abroad. Only 15% are subscribers. And they're really appealing to a global class of elites who benefit from the prevailing political order, right? This is who their new market plan is for. And one of their expansion areas was Australia, being that English language countries are, quote, the lowest hanging fruit, according to Stephen Dunbar Johnson, who's president of the New York Times International. Just yesterday, this is a big deal for the New York Times. They got a million international subscribers, so they can now say that there are subscribers to the New York Times in almost every country on earth, right? Which is everything the Times has always wanted to say. So, I mean, I think that they've managed to make this plan work, but they also do it at cost, and they're doing it very consciously, which is that, so Alan Rusberger, the Times hosted this thing at the Savoy Hotel in London in 2016, and he recalled hearing Dave McKay say, there's a new reality in which 98% of Americans were now excluded from the New York Times journalism and might well have to do with substandard information. This is like, they know, right? They know what is conscious. It's a conscious decision. So let's juxtapose the Times to other news organizations like the Miami Herald, which are these Goldilocks newspapers. They're not big enough to get the scale of the Times. And so what counts for them is just the small sort of local readers who they can actually advertise against, because nobody cares, if you get a reader from New York, they're not going to go to that pizza place in the Florida area. They're just not a valuable subscriber, right? So the geography matters when you're trying to get digital ad revenue. And so the Miami Herald, they had been ready for Fidel Castro to die for 20 years. Like, they had a plan. They were not going to get sued. There was no way they were going to get sued, right? And when I went to the Miami Herald, they actually had like this whiteboard in the room with the story ID code, the OBIT code, so they could call it up in the content management system. It's like lived in the center of the newsroom, right? And both newsrooms that I visited, both the old and the new one. And so they crushed it. They absolutely crushed it. They were ready to go. They got accolades from across the news industry. They had international readers, right? But these readers were coming for one or two stories. They weren't coming back. And actually, the effect of when this happens is because there's so little information on these readers, it can actually send the ad prices crashing on the programmatic exchanges. So you have a viral hit, and it actually, right, this laws of supply and demand kind of thing, right? So it ends up tanking. So we can have a journalism win, but actually an economic loss, which is very sad. So kind of where does this leave us then? And it's a very conscious thing where what ends up being prioritized are news for the rich, white, and blue, the white subscribers who are going to pay. And so I was at a forum, and this Midwestern news executive just plainly said it. We don't write for white subscribers, but it ends up being white people who read us, right? So people who are willing to subscribe. And so let's kind of take another case study and taking a look at the Dallas Morning News. It's an interesting newspaper because it's maintained some of its big business conservatism. It's kind of well respected in the city. It's got a two-tiered stock structure, so it's got these Class A shares that are still run by a family, but it only has 2% of its revenue coming from digital subscriptions, right? So what can they do, right? And so when I talked to Mike Wilson, who is now no longer editor-in-chief, he put to me, he's like, the pursuit of digital subscriptions has honed our focus on what we're covering, and then kind of mentioned that he's doing way more coverage of Plano than he'd like. Plano is where Dallas is set. It might as well be code for wealthy and white. And so what did the Dallas Morning News do? They set up the subscriber loyalty program. And so they're trying really hard, here's tickets to meet Emmett Smith, here's some special concert privileges, here's a special Facebook page, right? And they're taking some of these cues actually from public media's engagement strategies. Public media is not a bastion of equality, and the question of who gets to enjoy this is a real question. So when you look at what's happening, the retrenchments are not necessarily just about rich. It's not rich places that are experiencing most retrenchment, it's the poor places. And so Gatehouse cut Boston a chain of weeklies across 10 different communities because they said that they were, quote, not attractive to print advertisers. I was at a certain large headquarters of a certain large newspaper chain, and I was talking to one of the C-suite folks, and I was like, your sites load really terribly. And they're like, well, yeah. And I'm like, well, so there were people whose computers, phones aren't being able to handle that. And I'm like, well, the people whose computers are that slow are not going to subscribe. So that kind of gets us to, who is left, right? Who's willing to stay committed to being willing to pay for news? And this is sort of the kind of blue wealthy side to all of this. So if you look at this, what I've highlighted over here, 72% of Democrats say that news organizations should be preserved, even if they can't sustain themselves, compared to 22% of Republicans. 30% of Democrats, 38% of Republicans report paying for a digital news subscription, right? So I've gone off script, but if you want to come back and ask me for more of these poll details, I can tell you, right? So when you look at kind of the difference between who actually values local news and is willing to pay for it, Democrats will pay for an inferior product because they feel bad, right? And so this is what I mean, right? By the news from the rich, white, and blue, right? And so they're the subscribers in many of these places. But I want to kind of end on a note about where trends are going, right? And we've moved into talking about news philanthropy as a solution. Philanthropy is created by foundations in large part. Foundations are even more elite than newsrooms, right? It's literally like the richest people in the world, richest foundations giving away their money. So there are underlying problems with elitism that just kind of happen, right? Because this is philanthropy. And so I was really curious, like, would these philanthropic solutions reinscribe some of the existing inequities that we were seeing in access to this information? So using a data set from the DeWitt Wallace Center, actually, I looked at places that were like the news infrastructure of places and places that were kind of lower than their predicted value, and kind of, the partisan slant to those places. And what I found was there was really no association between places that were severely under-resourced in news and whether or not they got foundation funding. What I did find was that big blue places over-index for funding from philanthropy. And there was a geographic spread too, right? So big blue foundations, or foundations in big blue cities were increasingly given to other big blue cities or blue college towns, right? When you actually looked at who was giving to investigative numbers. So what does that mean, right? When the funding is coming from outsiders, it makes it really easy to question the intentions of the people who are coming in to fund news. And so in places that are deeply red, you have this starting a philanthropic news organization, great, right? Accountability, journalism, awesome, very easily dismissed. So one of the organizations I offer a case study of in the book, 100 Days in Appalachia, which is not an investigative site. West Virginia didn't have one at the time. They got written up on Breitbart, Google, ProPublica, center-left bias, George Soros Open Society Foundation, and a radically less Southern Poverty Law Center, right? It becomes really easy to discredit this organization. So what can we do, right? And I tried to come up with some things that maybe people hadn't talked about already. One thing I think we really can do is rethink financial aid in higher ed. Work study is an incredibly flexible program. It's federal money and it's kind of fungible, and different schools administer it in different ways. So could some of that be diverted to students working on the student newspaper? Could it be diverted to students working for local public media, right? There's ways to rethink this. Loan forgiveness, which I actually didn't have in the book, but I've since thought maybe journalists working for nonprofits could also kind of claim some of that loan forgiveness too. Second thing is just embracing our partisan media system. Look, like the New York Times has lost the right? And there's a whole generation of journalists and news readers, right, news consumers that want journalism that's focused on social justice, and they don't want people to hide right? It's kind of disingenuous, like we're playing it down the middle, but yet, all of the young journalists at the New York Times are social justice, would like to loudly be social justice advocates. So I just say, if the Republicans aren't coming back, lean in, right? It's far more intellectually honest to do so, right? Daniel writes about knowing what team you're on, right? Media being about it. Declare the team, right? Another thing, right, is maybe can we have a post-newspaper consciousness? So how do we think about what really matters? Saving newspapers is a fundamentally nostalgic way of romanticizing institutions that weren't always particularly good for their communities, quite frankly. What do we take from journalism, from newspapers that really is the best? What can we do and make different for each community? But we need to unbundle the functions of journalism and think about how to support those that are most important in place. And it may be different depending on different places. And then finally, I think it's really important that to realize that we bought into this very important, very powerful orienting myth about the importance for news in democracy, right? It is a really important sort of orienting normative thing, right? But we also need to ask, whose democracy were we talking about? So with that in mind, I hope that you've heard a little bit about the ways I think that place, power, and inequality are threatening to create a democracy that only serves. So with that, I have to answer your question. Oh yeah, if you ask a question, you can look.
So, Dr. Usher, that was a nice presentation. Is it true that initially you thought of this book idea as the where of news?
Yes, it is actually true.
So can you tell us how it evolved? Now, obviously, this looks much more attractive, and you shared initially how you expanded the project a little bit. Could you just explain the thinking process? Thank you.
So the thinking process between how I got from the where of news. So I was really thinking about the physical locations and the way that labor was changing. And I'm walking and we take a book so we pretend I'm on a game show. So yeah, right. So what happened was
Thank you.
Yeah. So in 2015, if you recall, Trump started making noise. And one of my best friends wrote an article, and the 7th paragraph, it was about a Nazi salute. And I'm like, why is that not the lead? Right? Why is this why is this there? Why did you write that? What are you doing? Right? And as that time continued, I do a lot of outdoor sports, so I'm often in places that maybe, and I kept seeing these signs that there was something really the way that my friends in DC were thinking about the presidential election wasn't what I was seeing on the ground, and it seemed so obvious to me. I would go to National Airport to do something, and I'd see that all the Trump books were basically sold out, and then there was a whole stack of Clinton books, and it's how do you explain this? And people say, who comes through National Airport? Who comes through the National Airport are voters who live all across the country, right? And so when 2016 happened, for so many other people, right, it was this reckoning point where I'm this, I have been thinking about this in a very, very narrow way. So that's kind of the story.
Thank you.
You already have a book, so do you want to point out somebody in the room you'd like to know? All right, well, anyway, so this time, yeah, go for it.
I have a question. What you thought about papers? Because I know there are state on military bases. Most military bases have that operate. They definitely don't make any money. I know that for sure.
Yeah. So actually, there's a category of military towns. Where's it? All right, I don't know where it went. It's in here somewhere. Come on. After this.
Here,
This exhausted. I'm not like quantitative enough to find my tables quickly. But yeah, so, you know, these, the army, the military, right, has semi-subsidized, semi-independent version. It's actually owned by the Stars and Stripes, that whole army. So it's an interesting sort of one of these interstitial players that don't get talked about enough. But generally speaking, my take on government funding for news tends to be very different from a lot of other people's. And I tend to think it's, I mean, you all in North Carolina can see what happens, right? The independence of your public media stations are threatened and compromised because they own the FCC license here, right? Board of Trustees. And so I mean, having lived for the past 5 years, it's really hard for me to think that we should have government funding for news and information. It just, I'm way too cynical. I just can't, you know. So anyway, yes.
Okay, so great, thank you. I love your talk. I
feel like Oprah.
Super excited. So I'm wondering the role of news and like a lot of research has talked about these vacuums, like as local newspapers diminished and they were by coastal, like this groundswell of news information filled that vacuum. And you know, I don't know where my question's going, but like I feel like there's
Where radio?
Well, radio one, and then like how do we even eat with radio now? Because this is such a major source of news for most of the country. And it's filled with inaccuracies, and it's essentially owned by like two conglomerates.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that, so when I was writing this book, I vastly underestimated the role of radio. In my current project, People in Illinois, Platforms, Politics, and Local News, in Illinois, the first thing that I was talking to people about was the importance of local radio, and even if it's on the country station, that one sort of morning hour where you're hearing from people, as being a critical source of what's going on, but also like recognizing that people who work with their hands or are driving trucks all day or whatever it is, they're listening to radio. And I think that that's a real reflection of the bias in the news industry and a lack of understanding of class, that like people who are doing work with their hands, if you're painting a house or building a house, you've got the radio on, you can't even really have a podcast because it's like, it's gonna fall down, something's gonna happen, right? So it's what people are listening to. Though Delilah is number 8, the Delilah show, so let's not lose all hope. She is recently. But I think here's the thing, like I really think the Democrats need to start funding local news organizations. There is absolutely no counterpoint message. There's nothing. And just like these Democrats have completely abandoned counties and just decided they're not going to run local office, we've seen a little bit of a correction of that. Like there is no counter narrative in many of these places. And actually, you know, doing some of this work in Illinois, I'm finding out that apparently like flyers are how people are finding out who's running for like local judge, because it used to be the League of Women Voters, but now they're all very old, right? Nobody's coming to replace them. The local newspaper you could win a judicial race if you were in the local newspaper, right? And now it's like they're getting a party mailer, right? They're getting somebody knocking on their door, putting a sign. That's how they're hearing about this stuff. So you need the Democrats, if they want to win, need counter narrative. I think they should be funding journalism. I understand this is heresy. I feel like I could see Susan in the back, like staring at me. I'm slowly turning to stone, just so you know.
Remember Mario Cuomo tried to be a talk radio guy like the guy who died.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Mario Cuomo? Mario Cuomo is a senator of my youth too, so I do.
He was, you know, the liberals have not been able to counter.
Yeah, I mean, I think that like on radio, right, maybe that's not the place. The podcasting is like, it has been doing really well. So, but again, podcasting is so fragmented. You have to have a place to listen to your podcast. So people listen to podcasts on the train, right? Like when, you know, it's an interesting thing to think about where you get your podcast from. Anyway, so, but I do think like, you know, these pink slime sites, right? These sort of, I would love to come up with a term for the astroturf because it's like there's an astroturf you can use where big developers are, funding small local sites and like, it's pretty good stuff, except it's about real estate and development, right? I don't know what the word is because it's got to be maybe it's astroturf media, right? But I mean, look, accept our partisan media system. Too much money in politics. I'd rather have a party-backed media of the 1820s than have Facebook funding my local news organization. So I mean, I think that's have we completely lost? In some places, maybe, yeah, but that's why you need boots on the ground. You need alternative narratives. I mean, you know more about those narratives than I do, so, yeah. Yeah. I can give you a button too. This is great. This is so much fun. Go for it.
Can I just ask a question on your recommendations? And I always like the last slides as far as the tangible next steps. You had the one slide on, I think 72% of Democrats said that they wanted to support news, and Republicans and independents were lower. I just want to make sure. But then as far as subscribers, they're all low. And so I wanted to ask, when you said kind of like lean in, just what your recommendations might be as far as whether it's partisanship or just when whether it's 25 to 30 seconds, regardless of ideology, just that kind of lack of subscription and distrust.
So again, this is digital subscription, so that doesn't mean they're not donating to public media. So that's one thing I think that often is the first paid thing that people are doing with media. But I mean, that's why I don't think we can really, like, I've given up on a commercial media system in many of the places that are adjacent to where I live. And so what funds that commercial media system? Well, one alternative is, highly nationalized news as read by a local DJ on the country radio station. What else is there? Is there a way to get out different narratives that target local communities? And that needs to be an investment of resources that it just cannot come from commercial places. Like, especially when you talk about rural America, there aren't any locally owned stores anymore. There wouldn't be an advertising base if you wanted, right? And then we talk about some of the bigger cities. I think the issue is there are tons of experiments, like Chicago is a really interesting city, Philadelphia, lots of amazing stuff, lots of media activism. And I think that's what's really important is the media that's being sort of produced as alternatives is very much embedded in activist local communities. And I think because of that, I was talking to a journalist at a certain news organization who was trying to figure out how to reach more people and be less elite. And I may have laughed at this person and said, I'm like, well, if you really want to do that, maybe you should partner with like the Afro-American NBC. Like, oh no, too advocacy. Right? And so anyway, so how do we empower those really cool media experiments to speak back to institutional power? And that's the missing link. A lot of great community news organizations, but they don't scare people. Sure. Oh wait. So yeah. I've got to give you. Sorry. We can do this more efficiently later. Please ask your question.
Just an idea that came to my mind. Thank you so much for the talk. I think it was amazing and very inspiring. Maybe it's a controversial topic discussed in the US, but it came to my mind because in Europe we pay many things from our taxes. So for example, we pay church, school, hospitals, maternity leave, different things. So if we can think of journalism as a public good, as a cornerstone of democracy, can we think of a system where we pay for journalism from our taxes? I don't know. I mean,
so what's really interesting is I think that right now one of the things that is before Congress is this Local Journalism Sustainability Act, and one of the things that it wants to put forward is a tax deduction or tax credit, which is different than a deduction, but a tax credit for subscribing to local news. There are already real equity problems with claiming tax credits, so it's like, so you're giving somebody might subscribe to a second outlet who is already paying for their public media news, but obviously it's a question of why is the U.S. not a better heavy partisan countries, pressure on even small pieces of government funding is really problematic. Like in Pennsylvania, when the legislature voted down $700,000 not going back to local media, like local public media, that's like a life or death situation for those stations, right? And so I am very reluctant to tie the fortunes. And you see that it's not a perfect situation. And I can go on a totally different rant about public media systems in Europe in particular. But as people cut the cord in the UK, just for an example, right, it's like $100 a month or $100 a year to have the right to have a television, right? That's hooked up in the UK. It's like the television tax thing, right? As people cut the cord, right, that revenue to the BBC has gone down, right? So it's not, you know, there are lots of, yeah. But if you want to talk about my rant about public media outside the US, I'll go. I can go on. Yeah, that's my hat, right?
Yes. What role, I don't know really how to ask this. I have one, but if anyone, I want to. I'm not sure how to ask this really, but what role might immigrant news media outlets have in this? Because they are very wealthy in their own right. And like TV Asia has a very wealthy channel. There's India Abroad, which has a lot of money. So what role might they play?
So I guess my question is, when you say, do you mean like the satellite television stuff that you're getting, or talking about like local ethnic media? Both. So like local ethnic media is very, very diverse, right? I actually did a lot of this in grad school with Metamorphosis project. One of the things that's really interesting is when you look at the content, it is significantly more about home country than it is about local space of origin, and about connecting cultural ties in the diaspora. And so the question is, like, can some of that be reoriented to more localized coverage? Maybe, right? As for the sort of television focused, I don't know, because when I think about the imprint of Telemundo, which I would have expected to like have an imprint, right? Like who gets like Telemundo barely makes it into the consciousness unless you know, like it doesn't make it into the consciousness of most, English language primary, like first language English speakers, even for kids whose parents were Spanish language speakers. It's just not what they're watching. So I don't know. It's a good question, right? But again, how do you connect? And I think the Armenian diaspora is really interesting because they have a lot of power, especially in Michigan. And so there's like an Armenian like local media hub thing, and they're able to kind of channel that power into the state legislature. But it's an advocacy direction you have to accept, and it's like it's not straight news for sure, right? I've rambled, but I got some, so I think I got somewhere. Yeah, sure. Oh wait, was there somebody?
Yeah.
Who wants?
Oh yeah, I have a book too. Who wants the book?
So ask your question.
Oh, sorry. This also might not be a fully formed question, but I'm thinking about independent, like when journalists go independent, like, Substack, for example, has recently been in the news, is like the Atlantic is coming in and trying to acquire a bunch of like popular Substack newsletters, which a lot of those were started by like journalists who are freelancers or maybe write for a primary outlet, and then they're using that as a revenue stream. Or like on TikTok, you have like Under the Desk News, which is like somebody who is like clearly has a liberal bent, but they're like a queer person giving the news in a funny way, or these kind of right-wing Facebook Live channels that will take and repurpose news in that framework. So what role do you think and that's why I guess like what role does that kind of maybe play, and do you see that kind of like independent, individual driven, subscriber-based journalism kind of supplementing some of this like kind of you're kind of describing having depth? Like,
I think it's a really good question because it's like the post broadcast democracy, right? And so when you have highly interested individuals who are very focused and interested in like whatever it is they're interested in, those provide particularly interesting like places to target attention. So yeah, it's a revenue stream for individual journalists to like make their name for a very limited audience, right? And that can be very disconnected. Like talk about paywall and like Substacks are like, how many Substacks do you belong to, right? And so I think that's a real problem for access and equity. But like I think that would be a great research question, like to what impact are these sort of, outside non-professional, like because influencers now, right? They comment on like they're news producers too, right? What is their role in informing and engaging? The problem is all of that is national attention, national politics. So being on the ground, like you imagine like a TikTok influencer like talking about LA City Council zoning. It's just not happening, right? So that's kind of where I think that's going.
One more?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like public and conservative. That's my question. Even though there's a lot of asymmetry in the media system, but the Democrats are also willing to pop the rules like 7 with Biden, 4 million under Hillary. I don't know how many million with Gore. So is that, I guess. So like, even with the asymmetric media system, how come they're still able to achieve some comfortable victories? And then I guess the question is, like,
I mean, I think this is the problem when you just talk about the relationship between news as input and then voter decision making. There are 10,000 billion things that get in the way. One of them being, right, one person, one vote doesn't work in Los Angeles, right? And you're redistricting. I don't mean to but wow, guys, good work on that. The state legislature really, what is it? They managed to divide any place that wasn't 49.9% Trump and me. So there's like issues like gerrymandering, there's issues like identity, and I think that what happens is people in our field, not really, I think people in political science really tend to divorce. This is ask him, he explains this better than I do. So, but yeah, I mean, I think that there's so many more things that get in the way of what you're talking about. I also am really curious, right? Because voter choices are more malleable, right? And so I question, right, like how do we read a Biden vote? How do we read a blue wave in the context of hyper-partisan, hyper-nationalist round 1 choice? And I don't know, having spent a lot of time with establishment Republicans in Illinois as of late, I would tell you that none of them are going to vote for Biden again. No way. Deborah, I guess we can do one more.
Sure, one more is fine.
I have a method work question, I guess. And that is, your book, right, talking about how do you find, I think that's one of the problems that scholars have a lot of times is we don't see people understand. So can you just talk a little bit about how you have about navigating your research and to scholars, of course, but also kind of to normal.
Yeah, I'm gonna pass that. So just so you all know, the justice people who sponsored this offered a kind honorarium, and I donated most of it to the book, so this is kind of coming back to you. So can you pass this to Dean? So I mean, honestly, I don't think I've done it all that well because in choosing one, I've lost. There's this tendency at ICA for certain European scholars to get drunk and tell me what they really think of me. That's not fun. Because, they're like, you're not theoretical, you're not this, you're not that. And I'm like, my degree is in intellectual history at Harvard University. think I really don't know how to read theory, right? Like, I mean, like, I don't say that because I'm usually shocked by the ratio of, somebody telling me what they really think of my work. So, I mean, there's a trade-off, right? And the trade-off is that within the conventional academy, people probably don't think I'm doing a lot of things I should be doing.
Thank you for not doing the mistake.
Hey, I appreciate that. But
I just want to thank you all for coming, and to Nikki for the brilliant address and the great gift to the world that is the book. So next semester, just to put this on your radar, we'll be visited by Eric Garcia, who's one of our alums and wrote an amazing book on autism. He's a journalist. And then in March, we will be visited by Wesley Lowery, who has a new book coming out, and also is one of the really big voices on journalism, objectivity, and race. And also, I noticed is your top blurber for that cover of this. So look for those. But thank you all for coming again, and thank you again to Nikki. And yeah, enjoy the nice.